Michael Smith is a professor at Arizona State's, meaning the Arizona State University School of Human Evolution and Social Change, and he has very impressive expertise in archaeology and anthropology. And then within those fields, he has two areas of emphasis, among others. Mesoamerican archaeology is one, and he's actually excavated homes in Aztec communities to draw inferences about their culture. And then he does comparative urbanism across geographic boundaries and across time. And I think it's in that field where he'll be spending some time with us today. He'll be suggesting that some of the challenges we face today with relocation from urban areas to other urban areas or rural to urban areas have historical precedent. And so without further ado, I am interested in introducing Michael Smith, and please start your PowerPoint and just take over the presentation. We'll wait until all three of us have presented before we invite questions. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm trying to share, but it says someone else is sharing.
We just stopped this share screen, so I think you should be able to share screen now.
All right. Can you see my presentation?
It's loading right now.
You're presenting a very good looking pinwheel there, Michael. Congratulations for the.
Sorry, it should load up any moment now. There we go.
We see your first slide.
All right, well, let's get to getting then. Did cities move in the past? My co-author Jose Lobo and I were each asked that question a while ago by Deborah Roberts, and my answer was, well, I think so, maybe, I don't know. And so we gathered together some colleagues, clever people with good data, and here we are. We make 5 claims. First, we can identify urban relocation in the past. Second, there were early urban contexts where urban relocation was common. Third, the drivers of urban relocation included both political and environmental forces. Fourth, politically driven urban relocation often had negative outcomes for residents. And fifth, there are cases of successful relocations. And then we had a question, is this material at all useful or interesting for folks at this conference working on managed retreat today? Please let us know. First, we can identify urban relocation in the past. Well, we found examples from all over the world from the last 3,000 years. And so the answer is yes, we can. IPCC defines it as planned movement of populations from urban areas that are of high risk due to climate change impacts as a form of adaptation to climate change. We're archaeologists. We like typologies, so we have 11 types. But basically today we're going to be talking about type 1 here, full urban relocation, and a couple of related types. You don't want me to go into the details on all these others. How do we judge the success of urban relocation or settlements in general in the past? And we've proposed to use settlement persistence. How long did a settlement last? The theoretical basis is described in PNAS a couple of years ago. There's just a random collection of early cities, how long they lasted. Settlement persistence, how the settlement system maintained its continuous existence, its continuous safe habitation over time. If a city lasted for 1,000 years, say, then it must have found a way to weather certain shocks, to adjust to certain shifts. It must have had a certain level of resilience if it's going to stick around for 1,000 years. That's our logic of using persistence as a measure. So there were early urban contexts where urban relocation was common. Chinese imperial capitals has to be at the top of the list. They moved on an average of every 41 years. It's just incredible. There were 5 locations, Xi'an, Beijing, Luoyang, Kaifeng, and Nanjing, that the imperial capitals returned to time and time again. Sometimes they built a whole new capital just down the road from an old one, and sometimes they built a new capital on top of the ruins of the old one. And these were big cities. Some of these cities reached 1 million population with major infrastructure and incredible investment of resources to do this. The median for all cities is 41 years. The graph capital moves per century. There were almost every century had 3 or 4 moves, and some centuries had 7 or 8 moves. Now we're going to look at a smaller scale society, the Iroquois villages. These are located in upstate New York and southern Ontario. Very dense settlements of palisades and living in longhouses. And piece of trivia for today, these settlements, the population density was twice the population density of Manhattan today. These were incredibly dense settlements. Field work by one of the co-authors, Jennifer Birch, they've identified sequences of villages, and time goes from the bottom to the top, which is the way archaeologists like to do it. And each sort of a vertical column here is a sequence of villages, one village after the other. So people knew that approximately once a generation, they're going to move the village. They just knew this was going to happen. This wasn't like a surprise, something that they have to figure out what to do about. They just knew it was going to happen and could plan for it. Mobile capitals. This is another kind of urban movement in the past. This is kings that didn't have a lot of power and they had to physically show themselves throughout their kingdoms in order to maintain their control. So Charlemagne of the Holy Roman Empire, here he is sitting outside a tent doing his business. Alfred the Great, Anglo-Saxon kings in England, Mughal India. Basically, they were big tent cities, thousands of people, and the whole court would move periodically, maybe once a month, maybe several times a year. Third point we want to make is the drivers of urban relocation include both political and environmental forces. So starting with political forces, well, new capitals, when you move a new capital to a new location to get it outside of existing power bases, and this has happened quite a bit in recent years. This graph is the frequency of new capitals. Archaeologists call these disembedded capitals. And the best known ancient example is Amarna, the so-called heretic pharaoh, Akhenaten, built a new capital so that he could get away from existing power bases of priests and polity in Memphis. Built this capital in 1346, major city, tens of thousands of people, major monumental architecture. 14 years later, he died and everybody went home. Political drivers, forced aggregation in colonial Latin America. The Spanish crown had a policy. Sometimes it was called congregación, sometimes it was called reducción, where they moved native peoples into new settlements. These are two of the main patterns here. The Yucatan on the right, they took villages and hamlets, scattered around and moved people into a central settlement that was much larger. They'd build a church and so on. So Mani was one of these congregation sites. On the left in the Toluca Valley, another pattern was you take settlements that were more isolated, sort of up in the hills here, and move them down onto the plain where they could be more easily accessed by the Spanish colonial road network. Another kind of a political movement was Spanish towns. The previous ones are called pueblos de indios. They were native settlements. These are Spanish colonial grid plan towns set up by the Spanish crown to do its business in the New World. This is Santo Domingo here. Note the sea monsters off of Santo Domingo. French geographer Alain Mousset has written a book on this. He identified 161 towns in Latin America with a total of 273 moves. And the number is certainly much higher than that because I know a bunch of cases that he didn't include. Why did they move? Well, according to Mousset, looking for a better site, unhealthy site, natural disaster, Indian attacks was the most common reason given, at least in some areas, and pirates and warfare. But the forced aggregation of peoples, the political movement of peoples into settlements in Latin America didn't begin with the Europeans. In the Andes, this started with the Inca Empire. They had a policy called Mitmac, where either whole villages or parts of villages, people were moved from one part of the empire to the other. And some estimates suggest that up to a third of the total population of the Inca Empire was moved this way at some point. Why did they move villages from here to there? Well, for both security, administrative reasons, and economic reasons. And all this, of course, was kept track by imperial bureaucrats with their quipus. Now, on to environmental drivers of relocation. In the southwestern U.S., we're back to a small-scale society now. The Four Corners region, the Mesa Verde region, where Colorado, Utah, New Mexico, and Arizona come together. In this area, the period from like 800 to 1300 CE was a time of increasing population, but also decreasing rainfall, decreasing maize yields, and increasing famine. So around just before 1300 CE, people picked up and moved. They moved several hundred miles down to the Tewa Basin, the area around what's now Santa Fe in New Mexico. Now, these systems of frequent relocation, these Latin American cities, Chinese imperial capitals, Greek city-states that I haven't really talked about, in most of these systems, most of what we know more about politically motivated changes than environmentally motivated changes. And part of this is a data problem. It's more difficult to identify environmental changes. Historical sources tend to stress the political and strategic things. Okay, fourth point. Politically driven urban relocation often had negative outcomes. The movement of a Chinese imperial capital, if they did this every 41 years, this was terribly disruptive to the resident population. Often they would just make people move to the new capital, or else they would round up people elsewhere and move them to the new capital. There's a master's thesis here that documents, this is one of the best described capital movements because a contemporary court official described the whole thing, and historians have analyzed that account. And the Jin dynasty, the capitals moved from Zhonggu to Kaifeng in 1214. And shortly after that, the dynasty fell. The move of the capital led to problems with agricultural labor and food prices, hardship, starvation. And this historian attributes that urban move, attributes the fall of the dynasty to that move. The Mi'kmaq settlements in Inca South America, fieldwork by D. Hu, one of our authors. Few of these settlements survived the Spanish conquest, and these settlements seem to have lower prosperity than other Inca settlements. So negative impacts of these political movements. Disembedded capitals. Dan Lawrence, this is some of the data he put together. This shows the regional average persistence compared to these moved capitals. So, for example, Amarna, the first one, only lasted 14 years, whereas the average Egyptian city lasted 800 years, which is, I'm still a little bit in awe of that figure, but I think it's correct. But the point is, a lot of these disembedded capitals, these newly constructed capitals, did not last as long as the average city in their region. We're trying to accumulate more cases and more data and to look at this a little more carefully. Now, some did. Some lasted longer than the average settlement in their region. The Spanish towns that Musset analyzed, 60% of them moved within 10 years. Okay, and so this was, we can infer, very disruptive to the residents, the populations. Our fifth point is there are cases of successful relocations. The Ethiopian court, for several centuries, moved its capital and moved these big tent cities around. And then the final move they ended up in 1884 in what's now Addis Ababa. The king, the Emperor Menelik II, a very powerful ruler, basically said, we're not moving anymore. And Addis Ababa was quickly developed into a prosperous city through trade and diplomacy. Here's a picture, early photograph from around 1900 on the left there. And Addis Ababa, of course, is a vibrant capital city today. So this is a success story of urban movement. Beijing, perhaps you can call it a success after moving around quite a bit, after many intervals as the imperial capital. It became capital of the People's Republic of China in 1949, and it's still, of course, a major city today. And the Taiwan migrations is an interesting case. In the period of increasing population and increasing droughts, there was increased interpersonal violence. The skeletal remains of burials from this time period, the gray graph is really going up at the top. After they move, the incidence of violence declined precipitously. And then a separate measure, a quality of life measure that Scott Ortman put together, shows minor increases in their original location, but once they've moved to the Taiwan Basin, the quality of life measure increases quite a bit. It took a while. It took some time for these positive effects to take effect, but the outcome was positive. So we've identified quite a few individual cases of past urban relocations. We've focused on settings where relocations were quite common in the ancient world. And we need better data analyses, and we're working on this. Urban relocation has been relatively rare since the 19th century, the wholesale movement of big cities. However, inner-city migration has been quite common in the modern world. Well, will future urban relocation be more like relocation in the past, where whole cities moved, or will it be more like large-scale urban migration? Is this useful? Is this relevant? Is this helpful? Are there things that might be useful for us to explore some more? Let us know. We'd like to find out. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Michael, for a great presentation and wonderful slideshow. Our next speaker will be Stephanie Stern, and she is the Desmond and Jean Ruley Kearns Professor, did I say that? Chaired Professor of Law at the University of Arizona College of Law. And she'll be presenting a paper, Retreating Agricultural Water Rights, a New Paradigm for Western Agriculture and Managed Retreat. I've been an admirer of her scholarship before I met her. I actually read a piece she wrote. I'm also a law professor, and read a piece she wrote, I think 15 years ago, in an entirely different field. She's quite a scholar, as is Michael, but I just have more basis on which to confirm that with Stephanie, because we're both law professors. She's published in the top journals in our field, and she also does some important work on climate-related matters, including working with the Arizona Institute for Resilient Environments and the Climate Health US-France Working Group. So while we're at it, you know who just made all this work so well is Emily. Let's thank Emily for the technological navigation. Stephanie, will you go next? Thank you.
Just 15 minutes. Just give me a wave.
Oh, yeah, I can adapt mine.
Yeah.
Whatever yours ends up being, I'll just fill, I'll shrink or expand mine, so.
So this is a very different paper and proposal. I'm wondering if Michael and I were put together to do our Southwest connection, but still focusing on the idea of mobility. And what I was interested in this project with my co-author, Dan Tarlock, was whether the managed retreat concept can be applied to water rights or other natural resources, right? Should we be thinking about retreating natural resources? One of the reasons this came up for me is that in the Southwest, when I moved to Arizona, I always get these questions, are people going to have to leave because of drought? Well, the answer is not really, because 75–80% of the water use is agricultural. So the sort of what we need to think about is how to shift some of that water from agricultural uses to other uses. Bearing in mind that some of that agriculture is very ill suited to the desert, right? So that's what got me interested in this idea of applying the managed retreat paradigm to natural resources. The situation in the Western United States, we've had a 20-year plus mega drought, the worst in 1,200 years. That's been confirmed by tree ring analysis. There's increasing desertification. And as I mentioned, in the face of this, we have a fair amount of agriculture throughout the arid West that is consuming currently the lion's share of the water. And it's starting to falter as I'm going to discuss. You might ask, how did this happen, right? How did it happen that we're growing? Yuma, Arizona is our major lettuce producer. And I'm just going to touch on this briefly, but it's very interesting. The country's settlement, there was a desire by both the government and the railroads to move people westward. And one of the ways they did this was they really put themselves behind what turned out to be a fake science. And I'm not, no one knows if this was known at the time. I think it probably wasn't. So the belief was that the rain would follow the plow, that once you started farming or planting trees, arid areas would become non-arid. And this was actually advertised on the train stations and so on and so forth. So we know that's not true, and that turned out to be a problem, and led to 2 historic drought retreats in the United States. The government also had a variety of subsidy at the country's settlement to move farming into the West. A lot of that was funneled through the Homestead Acts and basically giving away farmland. And then, of course, a little later, there was massive investment by the federal government in creating dams that would irrigate the farms of the arid West. There was also in this settlement period a shift. Originally, water rights were federally owned. And, technically miners and other people were trespassing on federal water rights. But through a series of court cases, and I think just sort of the federal government throwing up its hands and saying, we don't want to manage everyone's water, there was a shift to state ownership of water rights. And I bring that up because part of what Dan and I are suggesting in this paper is reintroducing a federal government role, right, in the form of this managed retreat. So what we're focusing on here is this idea of retreating water rights for environmental purposes. But we do also, sorry, I'm trying to just get this out of here. We do have another paper that's about retreating water rights for farming, for kind of just climate transition for farmers. It's different ways to think about this. One of the things we observed in that first paper, which focused on policies for farmers, is that drought retreat, what we call drought retreat, is occurring in the West. And how we're defining that is that agriculture is downsizing. It's shifting more east. Farms are being repurposed. And farmers are increasingly selling water rights, right? And we sort of established this history, which I don't think can be done quantitatively, but is clearly happening qualitatively in different reports and in the types of subsidies and programs states and localities are paying to farmers to transition their farms to tourism or solar arrays or other uses. So in the context of Western drought retreat, sorry, it just was a delay. The municipalities are coming in and buying up the water rights. And what Dan and I were interested in is that this might be an opportunity to address a long-standing water misallocation. When those rights were shifted to the states, there has been, in the vast majority of Western states, inadequate protection of in-stream flows and environmental interests, right? So, is there a way to reallocate water? Now, of course, I think drinking water is very important too, but as I mentioned, the municipalities have been exceedingly clever and vigorous in buying water rights from farmers. while the state and federal governments are sort of sitting there at a time that could be opportune. Now, you might say, well, do we need to think about managed retreat of water or other natural resources? And by managed retreat, I mean essentially buying the water rights, which I'm going to get to. We don't have a lot of good options for redistributing water to environmental purposes, right? If the state or federal government just takes the water rights, they have to pay compensation. I don't think this falls within, there's an emergency exception to the Fifth Amendment, but I don't think it falls within that. And so they would have to pay compensation and there'd be incredible political pushback. And you know, in the Western state that I'm from, it would be incendiary. There's prior appropriation, which is a state water law. And essentially, how that works in the States is that if there's an abandonment of a private water right, and there's nobody else in line for that water right, then it's gonna go to the state government. However, that doesn't work because most of the rivers, almost all the rivers, to my knowledge, in the West are what's called over allocated, meaning it's never gonna get to the state government because there's so many private users in line. And then there's markets. Well, is the market gonna handle this? And I think, you know, markets aren't so great. Fish aren't, you know, sort of market participants in that way, and aquatic ecosystems. And, you know, also, as I mentioned, the municipalities have been very vigorous, right? So, in this sort of drought retreat era in the Western United States, there is, you know, increasing concern about in-stream flows and aquatic ecosystems. So what Dan and I propose is a managed retreat of water rights. So what we were interested in was starting to think about this concept of managed retreat, which has been residential, and seeing could we apply it to water, right? In the West, a lot of water rights are standalone rights. Some of them are attached to land, but you could either buy the standalone surface water or groundwater right, or if it's attached to land, buy the land, which is a little less convenient and more expensive. And we saw potentially a role for the federal government as, you know, managing this retreat and providing funding. Like the residential managed retreat paradigm, we suggest it should be voluntary. And in the broader paper, we discussed different, you know, how might this work? And one option is to have farmers that want to sell their water rights. And there are farmers in the West looking to leave between the mega drought and the next generation not wanting to assume farms. So you could have bidding by farmers, you know, essentially the lowest price they would sell their water rights. And then the federal government could buy them and dedicate them to in-stream flows and other environmental uses. Now, one question you might have at this point is, well, it's always nice to say that the federal government should buy something, but can that, you know, is that really viable? So a few things on that. This is one of the few climate adaptation problems where there is actually a giant pot of money in the form of the Farm Bill, right? And I'm not saying it's an uncontested pot, but it has been used for some similar purposes like the Conservation Reserve Program, which pays farmers to basically not cultivate their land. So there's an enormous amount of Farm Bill money. There is disaster relief money that potentially could be repurposed. In the paper, we discuss a little bit whether NGOs could also participate. And currently, some of the state laws, there's in essence prohibit NGOs from buying water rights. It's been an issue in a few Western states. So there are potential sources of funding, and there's also I've delved more deeply into it, there's a history of countries that have managed to realign their water rights doing this. So Australia, when it transitioned to a different and more environmentally protective water rights regime, but they basically ended up paying directly and indirectly for some of that. In the United States, the drought contingency plan brokered by the federal government, that is paying farmers, including in Arizona, a lot of money not to farm, not to use those water rights. But at the end of the day, that agreement is only, I think it was limited to maybe 4 or 5 years. It ends in a year. It's time limited. You know, the government doesn't own anything. So we're essentially spending money to rent but not buy water rights right now. In the paper, we discuss, you know, science-informed models of water rights retreat, and I won't get into that in great detail, except to say there are existing frameworks. The Conservation Reserve Program, which I mentioned, has an environmental benefits index where you could rank water rights. So the insight here is that not all water rights are going to be equally valuable. And that, you know, the government is going to want to be selective, state or federal, if it's acquiring water rights. There's emerging ecological drought models that basically figure out environmental tipping points that could guide governments about, you know, how to selectively buy water rights in the most at-risk ecosystems. And there's also crop switching models, which are really amazing. I mean, agriculture is definitely a key here to water and carbon. And these are mainly researchers and think tanks that have created these models of moving agriculture to its optimal location, which obviously this isn't going to do, but it's going to improve it. And they've been able to cut fresh water use to nothing, cut carbon by 80%. So I mean, that's another source of scientific information for sort of thinking about how to retreat water rights. So there are, you know, there's a number of sort of challenges, objections, but I want to leave those for questions and just make sure I'm not taking up anyone else's time. So thank you for your time, especially as listening to this.
Shall we wait till you're ready? So you have a PowerPoint slideshow. So great presentation by Stephanie. Also, I highly recommend her article, which is available in 2 places. I think it's already been published by the Columbia Journal of Environmental Law, and then the SSRN version is what I read until I realized that it was probably already out in final form. And I think it's accessible. May I just double check while she's pulling up my PowerPoint? How many people in the room are students at the Columbia Climate School? No one? Are there any law students or lawyers here? Fantastic. What brings all of you here while she's pulling up my PowerPoint? I'm just curious. Are you traveling to come to this conference? Are you all from New York City? Just here.
I'm a senior planner in watershed management for Walker County Public Works up in Northwest Washington. Actually, I'm working on a big water rights adjudication and sale process. Also doing some sea level rise planning.
I can see why you'd be here. Where do you come from?
I'm from North Carolina and I'm a resilience fellow, but I work with municipalities on lots of different resilience projects, but some of that is water, some of that is wastewater, some of that is drainage, yeah.
Oh, wonderful. What's your story?
I'm a water resources engineer and I did my PhD and master's at WSU in Washington. Then my master's was about fire, but now I'm working on all my research is about changes in water rights, or not water rights, sorry, water security and how it relates to food security and potential mobility.
Are you still in Washington State?
No, I'm a postdoc here now.
Oh, got it. Okay.
So I'm split between Lamont Doherty and the climate school.
I might just checking with 2 more people since we're learning people's backgrounds. What's your story?
Nicole Beaker. I am a natural resource economist for environmental consulting company.
And
Based out of
where are you
Seattle.
located?
Seattle.
Oh, Seattle, wow. Big Northwest presence here. How about you?
Hi, I'm doing a master in economics, but I'm doing an internship with Becca.
Oh, and so you're here in New York.
Yes.
Got it. Okay, great. Thank you, Emily, for getting me all set up. I will introduce myself very briefly because I'm in charge of introductions. I'm going to be very brief. I am the Orlando J. and Marion H. Hollis Professor of Law at the University of Oregon School of Law. Now all the Washington people are going to hate me. Oregon and Washington.
Oh, no.
But we are on the same boat when it comes to wildfire risk. And I do see that some people in the room have positions that make me think you probably already had reason to consider wildfire risk and preparedness for wildfire. So to cast this in terms that are germane to our conference, this is about retreat of people from wildfire-prone areas. And what I want to focus on is the forested wildland urban interface, which I'll refer to hereafter as the WUI. WUI means wildland urban interface, and it's basically where development and human settlement either mix with or come to the boundary of undeveloped land and vegetative fuels. And I want to spend a little time presenting something that I wrote for the Georgia Law Review, but let's see, can I advance? Perfect. Let me give you some background. So there's a lot of housing in the wildland urban interface. I don't know if people are aware, it's by far the fastest growing area for housing. This is true in North Carolina, this is true in the Northwest, true throughout the country. And you can see in this map that the forested states also are seeing great growth in housing in the wildland urban interface. If you were to consider just the growth since the 2010s, it's 2.6 million homes. So now there's a total of 44 million homes in the wildland urban interface. It's not all forested. Some is grassland, some has shrubbery, but I'm going to focus on the part that's forested. The WUI has doubled in size since 1990, meaning that more and more people are setting up housing in this vulnerable area. And the number of homes within wildfire perimeters, meaning in areas that have burned, has doubled since the 1990s. You might wonder, why do people migrate to an area that you might argue is ill-suited for human residence? Well, there are lifestyle draws, proximity to natural amenities, some of the push factors. People are, especially out west, some of you may know in Washington and Oregon, we are experiencing some real challenges in our cities that are making people prefer to live in more rural areas. And then these rural jurisdictions are offering, cheaper housing, are offering cheaper taxes, the scarcity of housing in the urban West, and then zoning that is restrictive, even though Western legislatures should know that they could fit a lot more housing in the cities. There's a lot of political pressure from the not my backyard crowd. But largely it's explicit solicitation by people running rural jurisdictions that is drawing the migration of people. So in certain circumstances, not all circumstances, a human presence in the WUI, meaning residential presence, does increase wildfire risk. So there have been 60,000 homes destroyed since 2010, and that's probably a conservative estimate. Almost all those were in the wildland urban interface, and I'm referring to homes destroyed due to wildfire. Human ignition is the most common cause, although lightning is a cause both in the southeast and in the northwest. The human presence also creates constraints on preparedness. For example, we can't do controlled burns like we should. We can't do certain management strategies in close proximity to residences. And then the human presence changes firefighting priorities, which heretofore, before there were a lot of people in the WUI, might include letting some areas burn, or changes the priorities so that the fire trucks go where the people are instead of perhaps the most urgent places where containment could be achieved. So a common response, and I bet a lot of you have heard, is this instinct to simply exclude people from the wildland urban interface, especially the forested part. I'm not advocating this, but I want to put it out there as a fairly common response, not necessarily among scholars in this area, bless you, but among fire chiefs or people living in urban areas who don't want to pay for the fire costs. So there are three ways to achieve it. Some talk about a construction moratorium, which could be achieved through zoning, which could be achieved through just individual planning adjudications. Some cheer insurance retreat, the withdrawal of insurance or affordable insurance from the wildland urban interface. And some people think that will improve the health of the forest. And some would favor various forms of retreat, including compulsory retreat. I'll grant that this is a minority view. I'm kind of using this as a straw man argument because I think you need a more nuanced perspective. I will grant that some changes are crucial, but not those. in that precise form. So we've done wildfire mapping. I know other Western jurisdictions have done this as well. I just put up Oregon's map that was just recently completed and now has unanimously been rejected by every single senator in our legislature, whether Republican or Democrat, because it found, see that orange color? That is the highest level of wildfire risk. And it goes all the way down to tax lots. But it found that a vast amount of the land in Oregon has an impermissible or intolerable wildfire risk. Purple is the second worst, and green is closest to safe. And it just caused so many political problems I'll talk about in a moment. So let me suggest that this broad brush, or I should say across the board approach to moving people from the forested WUI would not work and would be undesirable, even if it could be accomplished. So there'd be public backlash, lack of political will, as Stephanie explained in her presentation. There's this concern, since I have no lawyers here, that you can accomplish a constitutional taking by regulation, even regulations that make it very hard to derive any economic value from your land, and the Supreme Court's even strengthened that doctrine recently. There are environmental justice concerns. You may not be aware that a disproportionate number of low-income people, minorities, and elderly people, all of whom can state an EJ claim, are in the wildland urban interface, to a greater extent than in cities. Moratoria on any construction or modification of homes only ensures that these homes that lack fire hardening, that lack, metal roofs and all the other things we need to make homes fire resistant can never be built. The ones that are out there now are ill-suited for the risk. We might take away the incentive for the best defensive measures like brush clearing and defensible space. Landowners might destroy their forests, much like scholarship has shown that when there's an imminent recalibration of what would constitute impermissible takings under the Endangered Species Act, people destroy the species habitat. And then the one huge question is, okay, what do we do with this abandoned land? Who manages after residential forest land owners leave? And Stephanie got into this, so I won't spend too much time here. If you're considering managed retreat for the forested wildland urban interface, you need to bear in mind a range of considerations. It needs to be voluntary. It needs to be net beneficial. We need to respect private property rights. We need to be careful with our overall budget for how we're going to respond to climate risk. And moving people from the forest may not be the best use. It may be in places like Paradise, California, but not throughout the forested WUI. So I'm going to suggest 5 things. I want to keep my presentation a little shorter, just to leave ample time for questions. First thing I want to suggest is it's absolutely necessary to stop these very high density subdivisions that are right at the edge of the forest. They create and by high density, I mean, look at what you're seeing in the slideshow. These are, far less than 1 acre lots. And they create the greatest risk of human ignition. They distort normal forest management to the greatest degree. They're the most incongruous management you could imagine next to a forest, and create problems that are self-evident. A second measure that's crucial, and I hear that some of you are urban planners. NIMBYism burns forests, and I'll say it again, they should have Smokey the Bear go talk to these NIMBYs. The problem is when people who insist that building denser housing stock in cities, when they drive the people seeking affordable housing into the wildland urban interface, what they do is, in essence, cause much higher risk of fire and much greater environmental degradation than if we accommodated the maximum number of people in cities. Oregon just got rid of single family zoning. And I hope other states do that too, meaning single residence zoning on urban lots is no longer permissible throughout the state of Oregon. So the third part, I'll preface with disclosure that I am the owner and manager of a 240-acre forest land that's within the wildland urban interface by Eugene, Oregon. I'm a 4th-generation Oregonian. Our family's been in forestry. This is not our family's historic land, but I just was excited to manage it before the big wildfire risk came. And now it just takes every free minute I have. We've devoted a portion of it to a state certified wildlife management and conservation zone. Definitely not doing it for profit. But I want to suggest that there are some people living in the woods whose presence is net beneficial. And so in Oregon, for example, if you want to create a residential lot in forest land, even in the wildland urban interface, if it's got forest land zoning, the minimum size is 80 acres. So I want you to imagine whether clearing these people out of the forest helps or hurts. Well, first of all, owners in that category are more likely to have non-commercial goals. They're out there for privacy, for aesthetic reasons. They're planting species that do not pay off when you mill them. So for example, the drought-resistant species aren't the fir that some of you from Washington are familiar with. The drought-resistant species are pine and things that the market won't reward. But the family forest landowners plant that stuff because they know it's more likely to withstand drought. Family forest landowners have access roads, they control brush, they remove fuels, they have a strong personal stake in minimizing the risk of fire because they live there. More than half of them live on their property. So they offer the best hope of long-term carbon sequestration. And what you need to realize is industrial forestry, meaning the warehouses, the big scale forestry operations, is fleeing the wildland urban interface. They can't aggregate holdings to achieve the economies of scale they need. They are just not patient with all the headaches that come with being proximate to human development. And so they don't want to come back and buy individual parcels. I mean, the government in my state can't even manage like urban parks. They don't want to buy abandoned parcels. So you got to consider as we decide whether the family forest landowners should retreat, what happens next? Those parcels might not be snapped up by any other buyer. So to support family forest landowners, there need to be tax incentives to grow non-commercial species or to lock up land for conservation. Presently, those are inadequate. Access to insurance is a huge problem. Other panels have talked about that. I have some thoughts about how best to ensure access to insurance. Two more quick slides. Voluntary retreat should begin in the most dangerous regions. There needs to be a market-based assessment pre-fire. I'm really wanting to wrap up here, so I give lots of time for questions. Environmental justice must be a huge priority, and preserving communities is also important. So sort of piecemeal movement of people within communities is less likely to accomplish that. And then I think I'll just move to the last slide and leave tons of time for questions because we only get till 6:30. Our wildfire mapping is hugely problematic now. One of the problems is there is no way to change a map. Once the map suggests a fire danger, insurance companies want to pull insurance, but the state can't be bothered to update maps or to reflect the reality of what's on the ground. So one of the problems is this mapping system might sort of doom places classified as underprepared or too dangerous. It might permanently relegate them to be uninhabitable, uninsurable. And so there's nothing inherently wrong with mapping, but the present version of mapping that some jurisdictions have used is not sufficiently responsive to the actual conditions. And what I think I'll do now, even though I have more to say, I think I want to wrap this up to make sure we have a good 15-minute period for questions. And the question and answer period is for all speakers. I see Michael's still there, and I might invite Stephanie, so I'm not the only one up here. So I think we need to record. Are we recording? So I think you and I both need to be by the mic.
Okay.
And does anybody have a, in fact, why don't you, I think we're going to draw a question for sure. Anybody want to go first, please?
That was all really interesting. Thank you very much for sharing. Michael, my question is for you. When you were talking about all of these different moves over the past hundreds and hundreds of years, I started asking myself, well, when did we stop moving? But that's actually not the question I want to ask you. The question I'm most interested in is, you said that forced settlements were the shortest surviving settlements. And capital moves were part of that and were also very short-lived as compared to like their average counterparts. And I would think, okay, in a political setting, they're being forced to, this is not a planned settlement, okay, whatever. But thinking about receiving areas in a managed retreat context is similar to those capital moves. It was a planned area, somebody thought it through, they brought people over for a purpose, but they still didn't last very long. And so I'm curious what you think was missing in that recipe that we could apply nowadays to make these new receiving areas more successful, and if there are any infrastructure or systematic improvements that exist today that didn't exist then that would help that process. I'd be curious to hear more about that.
I'd love to be able to answer that. That's a very good question, and I think we have a bunch of work to do to figure out that kind of question to link. I mean, we're just trying to, we've been trying to assemble this information, and so our analysis of the dynamics and comparative analysis of these past cases is really very incomplete. And so, but on the other hand, if you say, okay, is the past relevant for understanding things today? Well, I can't really answer that as an archaeologist. It's you folks who are working on contemporary things that have to answer that. Now, you can't answer that if we haven't provided data about it, right? So it's a recursive thing. But I think it requires greater interaction between historians and archaeologists and contemporary scholars, practitioners, and stakeholders. And I mean that's why we did this paper at all. It's like none of us archaeologists thought, well, let's figure out how cities moved in the past. I mean, it turns out, well, that's interesting. We're glad we're doing it. But it was a question from Deborah Roberts at a climate security workshop. And oh, you're an expert in ancient cities. I'd really like to know, did cities move in the past? And well, let's try to figure that out. So I think we need more interaction with the people working on contemporary issues in order to figure out the best way to bring together those data from the past and perhaps draw lessons for them. There's no end of archaeological papers that say this is relevant for understanding the present, and most of those are bullshit because they're just they're really the Maya collapse. The Maya collapse is relevant for understanding sustainability today. Well, guess what? We don't understand the Maya collapse. How's that relevant for anything? And so, one of the things I'm trying to promote is a rigorous analysis of the past so that we can make some of these connections as a more empirical and rigorous kind of thing. So thank you for the question. I wish I could answer it.
Of course, thank you.
Is there another question? I have one I could ask. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I have one. I find the idea that you propose really interesting. A lot of my PhD research was about just water and food systems in general and how they go together, and especially in Washington where you have a snow dominant ecosystem really heavily reliant on snowpack, and that we can't really do anything about that. So essentially, how are we going to better manage a system that's no longer going to have the foundation that it was built on? And I think water banks have emerged as something that's been very useful in Washington for trading water rights and selling water rights temporarily, just so you don't fall prey to the use it or lose it doctrine. And so I wonder how you could see water banks as potentially a mediator in sort of what you propose for Arizona.
Well, so I think by water banks, you're really talking about facilitating a water market system, right, with trades. In Arizona, and I believe in other really arid Western states, there is a problem that I think is accelerating where investment companies have formed and they're buying water rights and they're holding them, right, while they watch everything, go into desertification and so on and so forth. So, I mean, that being said, I personally am not anti-market, but I think there is an issue that the emerging water market doesn't have any of the sort of guardrails that we put on other types of market. There's no antitrust department looking at it. There's no consumer protection bureau, and sort of so on and so forth. The other point I would make, so markets have been sort of, in Arizona, it's emerging as a big problem because they're just speculating and holding. a significant amount of the water. The other sort of issue that I see is because the United States system is so oddly privatized, I mean, so highly privatized. The part that I'm looking at, in this paper at least, of environmental benefits, there has not really been a buyer, to represent those interests. Now, I did look a little bit in this research at whether the big land trusts were starting to buy water rights. And the answer is that some of them are, like the Nature Conservancy, but they're not, it's not enforced, and they're running into state laws, and I think in other countries, there are laws that prevent them from buying rights. So it's sort of, I think, that perennial problem of like, who speaks for the environment, or who buys for the environment with the market.
What funding sources remain. Maybe I'll shift gears slightly. Why is voluntary your go-to versus a more regulatory, or at least a combination regulatory voluntary approach, like the well-land development?
So I would mix mandatory approaches with voluntary approaches, but I think that each is well suited for a particular state. So I would create mandatory zoning that doesn't permit some of the building, for example, or some of the uses that are so likely to cause fire danger. Once people have moved in, I think some of the current Supreme Court jurisprudence makes it really difficult through regulation to drive people out. I think then you have to pay, in effect, you're paying them the compensation that you otherwise would need to offer as a voluntary inducement. And, the Supreme Court in a succession of cases, as recently as the Sheets case, really seems determined to treat regulatory takings as actual, seizures of property. So I think what I would do is have a very strict zoning code enforced for people who have not yet moved to the woods, right?
Not yet developed a lot.
What's that?
Not yet developed a lot.
Right. But I think here's the problem. If people, for example, are out in Washington in a fire prone area, and I do think you have some, even though you're further north than we are. And it's an elderly couple, which tends to be the demographic out there. And all of a sudden, these draconian restrictions make it impossible for us to get insurance, for them to get fair market value selling a home. They're not going to leave. They're going to remain there. That's what all the evidence suggests. People, tough regulations don't drive people away. They lead people to remain on site and just, assume that they'll survive a fire. So I don't think it actually achieves a reduction of wildfire risk to have a mandatory approach with respect to people who are already there. Now, I do think you can create all sorts of guardrails, right? I mean, so if people want to do further development on their property, you can mandate defensible space, mandate use of certain materials. As properties change hands, perhaps that might present an opportunity, right? But I do think there's a place both for a mandatory and a voluntary element to inducing some sort of more resilient behavior out there in the woods. Did I address your question?
Yeah, no, that makes sense, and that's my approach as well for the wetland urban interface, for the sea level rise inundation zones, is trying to push essentially down zoning to restrict any new development. Then we move into more voluntary actions for people that are already there. But
That's a good question, by the way. Unless somebody has a question, might ask Stephanie a question I had when I read your excellent paper, which it appears you posted in May of 2024 on SSRN, which is how we law professors broadcast our work before we actually place the authority. So maybe you put yours up after you placed. My question is, would you have written the same paper after November 2024, knowing that Donald Trump was in fact our president? And I wonder if, just from the news lately, he appears likely to try and get more of the Colorado River to cities like in Arizona, right? And so does that make you worried that the federal government, even if it were to acquire, rights to water, would not dedicate it to in-stream flow, or would you write the same paper in January
Right.
2025?
Well, it's interesting, environmental law professors don't have a lot to write anymore because all of our proposals now seem like completely far-fetched in a way they didn't. A year ago. So I guess the question is, can the federal government buy water rights and use them for sort of objectionable purposes? Yes, the states can respond to that, though, I think. I mean, the states could pass laws that, restrict that or protect in-stream flows or this or that, because they are still ultimately the owners. But I hadn't quite considered the degree of and speed of dismantling of environmental and water protections. And I think I was in denial about the election.
I still think it's a great paper, and you know what, there will be a dawn in 4 years. Perhaps, when they pick up that paper and say, hey, well, let's do something to improve the water allocation. Let's see, how are we doing on time? We have time for another question. Please go ahead.
Another one for Stephanie.
Yeah.
You were saying that these farmers were allowing municipalities to buy up their water rights. Where do they go after they sell? Are they farming elsewhere? Are they picking up and going, are they gonna go buy water rights a couple acres over? Or do they go and become a computer programmer? Like what? Right. Like
That's a great question.
what do they do?
Yeah, so I mean, there isn't a lot of hard data on this, but I sort of did, a deep dive trying to talk to people, look at news articles, just discuss through all my contacts in Arizona and the West. It is the minority situation that someone like picks up and relocates their farm to water-rich Virginia, right? There's examples of it, particularly with younger people, right? But the average farmer is fairly old, right? And there seems to be much less of that. So the things I saw were sort of, retiring, right? They were at a turning point anyway, and there wasn't a person in the younger generation interested in taking on a farm. And it is more affecting the smaller farms, right? They're not buying from the big corporate farms. There was some repurposing going on, like the tourism, the solar arrays, different things of that nature, right? So those were probably the two major ones that I saw. And then there was it seemed to be a lot of people moving away, but not farming, like sort of this abandonment zone. There's a lot of them in California where they've just lost massive amounts of population. And, they're sort of like down to one elementary school. So just moving away, but not moving the farm.
Western Washington, you can't get a new agricultural water right, but you still can permit new residential exempt well. So there's water for domestic uses, but not for agriculture. So a lot of farmers are shutting down and developing.
Yeah, sell to a developer.
Right.
Yeah.
We have run up against our time limit. I want to thank everyone for sticking it out, even though it's dinner time. And thanks to my fellow presenters, it's only for coordinating the tech. I would love to stick around and talk to people. I have to go teach my students. I assume from my hotel room. So excuse me, I have to leave, but it's great to see so many Northwesterners here. That was not what I expected.